I was recently in a forum with other Westerners talking about various different residency and banking options. And one of the most common misconceptions that I saw within this discussion was that banking in the US is only available to Americans. Now, this is very much so not the case. We do a lot of our major banking in the US in terms of using US exchanges for investments and brokerage services, credit, and banking. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how you can get into the US credit system as a non-American and who this may be easier for versus some nationalities where this may be more difficult, and then also some other jurisdictions around the globe where banking looks different but is still very secure. We're going to be talking about Europe, Asia, and Latin America. So first and foremost, we have to address that banking in the last few years has become increasingly more uncertain in most jurisdictions around the globe. Now, of course, many years back, we saw the trucker protests, for example, in Canada, where the government had the legal right to block the bank account and to leave citizens and residents of Canada without any access to banking, essentially leaving them unbanked for a small amount of time, but still a amount of time because they were doing something that the government didn't like. Now, we have seen similar displays, not so much on a grand global scale like this in Canada in 2020, but we have seen other displays of this in other countries. And this is one great example that really showcases the importance of diversification, not only in your life, but also in banking diversification, where you're holding your investments and where you have access to debit cards, credit cards, and just general bank accounts. So first, let's look at some other jurisdictions around the globe that do have very solid banking. Now, before going into this, I will say that what we have seen here at Worldwise Capital, I will say even within the last 8 to 10 months, but certainly within the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen banking become increasingly more difficult in many jurisdictions that we operate in around the world, where with a very low minimum, you're looking at 10,000, 20,000, you in the past would be able to remotely open a bank account. Now, this is still the case for some jurisdictions, but very much so not for nearly as many jurisdictions, even 6 months to a year ago. This is not a bad thing. We always tell clients this is not necessarily a bad thing. It does mean that banking is becoming more difficult. Yes, typically you will want to have residency, be on the ground, have enough of a minimum to make banking in that jurisdiction worth the bank's while, especially for a non-resident. But it very much so varies depending on the country, the jurisdiction that you are looking at. But regardless, you do want diversification in banking. So let's first look at some of the more traditional, classic banking options that are still in today's day and age very solid. They have become much more difficult to open, but what are some of these options? So Switzerland is, of course, one of the main options. If you're looking at fairly secure banking, you're going to be typically looking at higher minimums, typically around 1 million, regardless of the bank that you are looking at. If you are a non-resident, a foreigner looking to store money in Switzerland, going to be a higher amount. You can expect around $1 million USD. However, this is a good banking option if you do have 7 or more figures, and if you are a EU resident. There are also some solid trust or foundation options that we often will pair with banking in Switzerland. Doesn't mean that you have to have the trust based in Europe, but there are some options where you can bank through your Switzerland bank. Now, next up is Singapore. Singapore is not quite as high of minimums yet. This could always change in the future, but typically you're going to be looking at 6 figures, around $500,000 is what you can expect to get accepted into banking in Singapore. Now, Singapore is infamously known to have quite a bit of paperwork. Of course, on the residency side, they make it extremely difficult, if at all available, for foreigners to get residency, and banking to a degree does emulate this. It has become increasingly more difficult as the years have gone on to open bank accounts in Singapore. If you have a business in Asia or you have a center of life in Asia, this may be slightly easier as well, especially from a documentation standpoint. Now, interesting to note here that many banks will not accept Americans. So if you are American and you have tried to simply walk into a bank without having a private client manager on your side, you will probably face either challenges in documentation that is needed, or banks outright, the tellers outright telling you that as an American, you cannot open accounts in their country. Now, this is simply due to the documentation that the US has with other countries, making it extremely less lucrative for banks in other jurisdictions to open bank accounts for Americans. But funnily enough, Americans and most sanctioned countries are the countries that most jurisdictions will not, if you're simply walking into the bank, will not want to open accounts for. So you're looking at North Korea, Iran, and then America is on that list as well. So that is an important consideration if you are American. Of course, especially if you're not leaving the country, if you're continuing to keep either residency or citizenship, you will still have access to US banking, a very, if not one of, if not the best banking system. Still to this day, yes, it is not without its problems, but one of the best in the world, one of the most secure in the world. So as long as you're not leaving the US as an American, officially, you can physically be outside of the US as long as on paper you're not officially leaving the US, then you can still use the American banking system. And most American clients that we work with do opt, if they are not renouncing their citizenship and completely leaving the country behind, even if they're living abroad, they do opt still for American banking. You can have different structures and bank accounts placed on top of that. Company formations, trusts, foundations, bank accounts, investment accounts placed on top of that. And that can be tax optimized depending on the jurisdiction. But banking in America is still very lucrative, of course, especially for Americans. So while we're on the topic of banking in America, the US dollar is the world's top currency. I mean, there's a lot of debate around this right now, but it will likely continue to be the top currency in the globe. Now, if you are looking to get into the US banking system and specifically into the US credit system, which may become increasingly less lucrative just with the devaluation of points, which many clients are after when they're going into the US credit system, as US and institutions within the country are changing the point and credit system. So that may become less lucrative in the future, but it is still, from a peace of mind and a security standpoint, a great country to hold your money in. Of course, all major banks have FDIC insurance, which not every country, most countries do not offer this, especially if you're looking at countries that are still developing outside of Europe or the West. So there are certainly still, even without the credit hacking and points system, still major benefits to banking in the US. Now, if you are able to get into the US visa-free, you do not need an LLC, you do not need to have a corporation set up, but if you do have visa-free access, then you can simply go to the US and open a bank account. Now, there is certain documentation and requirements that those at the banks are going to want to see when they start to open your account. And of course, there typically are minimums, but a common misconception is that an LLC is not required. What is required if you're looking to get into the credit system is an ITIN number, an individual taxpayer identification number. So this is similar to an SSN, a social security number for Americans, but it identifies you as a foreigner in the US system. If you're interested on the full breakdown on how you can get into the US banking and credit system and what that journey will look like for you, what that journey has looked like for many of our clients who go to the US on their own and who do open these accounts, we have a full course detailing the breakdown of what that journey is like and what you can expect from that process below. So you can click below to learn more about that. However, if you are interested in getting into the US banking system, now is going to be the time. As I mentioned previously, we have seen various different, specifically territorial tax countries, which makes it a lot more beneficial for a lot of our clients to not only bank in, but also to invest in. The criteria and the restrictions around opening accounts, even in the last, like I said, 8 to 9 months, has become more difficult. And so it's no longer an option for some of our clients who are looking to do this remotely with very basic documentation and no ties to the country. So if this is still available now, the US banking, which it is, this is something that you want to ensure that you gain access to now before documentation and requirements does become more stringent. Now, if we're looking over to Latin America, and we have talked about this in previous videos, does have some solid banking options. Now, some of the jurisdictions in Latin America that we work with and that we see clients most interested in is going to be Uruguay, Chile, and Panama. Now, Uruguay, Chile, and Panama, again, these are some countries that have become more difficult for non-resident banking. There are still options if you are not a resident in these countries, but specifically in Panama, if you have non-residency, now you do need to physically be present on the ground if you're looking to open a solid banking account, not just one that can be opened online or crypto friendly with insane fees when you get into the numbers of what those fees look like. So there is still options, but like I said, it is becoming more difficult and it is taking longer to open these accounts for most clients, especially if you're just walking into the branch without having a manager contact beforehand. Now, Uruguay and Chile, in both of these jurisdictions, and this did not used to be the case, but now you do need residency in order to open these bank accounts. These are very secure banking jurisdictions in Latin America. Panama is becoming increasingly more popular for the banks that are, again, not accepting everyone. You want to be in a solid bank and become a part of that institution and start working your way toward credit in time with a bank that is going to respect your relationship with them and not open accounts for countless foreigners on end, which unfortunately is the case for some banks in Panama. Now, Panama, as we have spoken about before, is increasingly becoming more popular for many of our clients around crypto banking, being able to send crypto to and from various different jurisdictions, most countries in the globe, and also to business accounts. Not only this, but also having access to debit cards where you can spend various different cryptos all over the globe, not only based in Panama. So this is still a solid option for many of our clients. It's also important to note here that with most countries in the world, you will need to hold residency, not necessarily citizenship, but almost always residency if you are looking to open a bank account in that country. So most countries, if you're simply on a tourist visa and you're traveling in that country and you go into a bank to simply ask a standard teller at the front desk if they will be able to open an account for you, the first documentation that they will want to see is your ID or your residency card in that country. So of course, you being on a tourist visa, you don't have access to this. So banking is really only available in certain jurisdictions in the globe. And like I said, it is becoming much more difficult. So if you are interested in banking offshore or potentially bringing yourself, your family, or your business offshore, but really banking is a core component of this that unfortunately we see a lot of clients not thinking about and thinking about their payment processors, their banking for both individual and corporate as the last piece of the puzzle, then you can reach out and you can book a consult with us below if you're interested in certain jurisdictions, relocating offshore, and tax and global optimization. If you're interested in learning more about global diversification, click the video on the screen now and I'll see you there.